Oh, hi there, friends. Mandy here. Restorative grief is all about creating easy access to healing no matter where or who you are. That's why I want you to remember that if you want grief support beyond a podcast, my 31-day guidebook is available to order on Amazon. Embracing our losses without losing ourselves is a reflective journey into the holistic needs of grievers and learning to support yourself, mind, heart, body, and spirit. Don't just wing it. You can lean into grief work with a guide. The link for the book and more are available in the show notes, and as always, you can reach out with questions. But for now, let's get on to this week's episode. Welcome back to Restorative Grief with Mandy Capehart. You are listening to episode 189, titled We Must Grieve Together with Olivia Abousaid. As much as I would like to say that the current season of life we are in collectively is unique, this is nothing new, and it is something we and other cultures have experienced repeatedly over time. So, what is a person to do when they are grieving and facing down something that feels relatively new to them? We can look for people just like my guest today, Olivia Abousaid. She's a master certified grief and transformation coach and the founder of Pact Coaching. Her practice is deeply informed by her own Palestinian roots and personal journey through various forms of loss, including familial bereavement, systemic racism, and chronic illness. Olivia specializes in guiding long-term grievers, especially those affected by war, genocide, and collective trauma, toward healing and empowerment. Her work focuses on transforming grief, fostering resilience, and building community support systems. In our conversation today, we are talking about the intersectionality that we face as humans in such a time as this, and the ways that we can care both for our individual griefs and begin to tend to the collective grief we are feeling in a way that is meaningful, culturally intelligent, sensitive, and relevant to the needs of ourselves and our communities. Hey everyone, welcome back to Restorative Grief with Mandy Capehart. I am your host, Mandy, and today I am joined by Olivia Abousaid. She's a master certified grief and transformation coach whose work really centers on helping individuals and communities navigate grief, particularly in the context of war, genocide, and systemic injustice. Just casual conversations that, frankly, we all need to learn how to become far more comfortable with and culturally attuned to in our effort of creating healing spaces in our world. So, Olivia, thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you so much for having me, Mandy. I know it's not the lightest conversation to have, but definitely a necessary one. And I think one thing we learn about grief is to find joy and lightness and things like that that can help us move through grief.
Yeah.
So I'm sure we'll be talking about that some more, but I really appreciate you having me on the show.
Absolutely. So, as with most people who get into this work, you have personal connection to the work that you do, the specific areas of grief that you tend to. How has your life experience brought you into deciding this is an area that deserves more attention and care?
So when I first got into coaching, I was thinking of being a transformation coach. And then I started to think about why do so many people need transformation? Why are people stuck in place and unable to move on to that transformation they're looking for? And I started to think about my own history with grief. I've lost a parent, I've lost two pets, I've been in serious car accidents, and I've experienced a lot of racism, both systemic and on a personal level. And sometimes you don't even recognize that you're grieving until someone brings it up to you, brings it to light. I think most people in society recognize that when you lose an immediate family member or a spouse, that there's a grief associated with that. But I don't think people think about it as much in terms of my career didn't work out the way I thought it would, and I don't know who I am now. They don't recognize that grief can also be that it can be car accidents. They don't recognize that it can be bad friendships and the loss of friendships and things like that. And so I started to think about that in terms of my own transformational coaching. And I said, you know what? I need to go back to the grief part of it and address that before people can make that transformation. So that's really what brought me into grief coaching.
Yeah, transformation is such a beautiful end goal, right? And it's an
Hmm.
ongoing process, but you have to be cognizant of all the things you carry, what you're transforming out of or away from before you can really begin this process of rebuilding what you're hoping to rebuild. So I love that the insight really resonated with you quickly and early in your
Uh-huh.
career. So you could create such a healthy place for yourself to work from too. And question, because you touched on it for a moment there, addressing how you experienced a lot of grief around systemic injustice and even racism that you witnessed and experienced personally. How has that and your heritage influenced the work that you do? It's a very whitewashed industry, right? Thought
It
leaders
is.
and grief leaders, and it's exhausting and it's hard because it misses so many demographics of people who also have different experiences of cultural grief.
I'm so glad you brought that up because people of color, as they experience grief or experience, they're experiencing a little more nuance when it comes to
Mhm.
grief because they've experienced so much more of that systemic and personal racism. And so, that's something that I try to bring into my own coaching. There's definitely an intersectionality that needs to be kept in mind. For me, it was growing up Palestinian. Whether you like it or not, you are born into politics as a Palestinian. And it's just part of who you are. You can't help but bring it up. People can't help but get into political conversations with you when they find out that you are Palestinian or Palestinian American. And, we experienced a lot growing up. I grew up with both Gulf Wars, and there was a lot of anti Arab sentiment when it came to that. At one point, we were even getting death threats, which is a crazy thing to be cognitive or cognizant of as a child, that you have to be afraid of some unknown thing out there who's there to hurt you simply because of your ethnicity. And, that extended to, when 9/11 happened, there's a lot of anti-Arab racism. And these days, we're seeing also a lot of anti-Arab racism with the genocide that's going on. Um, that's been super politicized. So, um, yeah, it continues and it's ongoing for a lot of the people in my community. They're experiencing a lot of grief and helplessness right now with what's going on back there. And, people are asking the question a lot, what can I do for the people over there? And then also for me and working through my grief.
Mhm. You mentioned you can't help but be political being born Palestinian. And I think you can't help but be political being a griever either. When we recognize
Hmm.
how realistic it is that every person we know will experience grief, or to your point, is experiencing grief and can't name it, it is affected by political policies and world policies every single day. The way we grieve, the way we are prevented from grieving or expressing ourselves. And I think about people who are looking to be supportive, but also recognizing that they lack cultural intelligence about the intersectionality of people of color's lives and the ways that they are grieving. How can your coaching address that gap of knowledge for someone who isn't necessarily a person of color but wants to come and work with you for your awareness of the cultural sensitivity and the importance of it?
That's a great question. I think it's a willingness. I think it's
Mm.
kind of what separates some people from other people. There's sort of a privilege that comes with not being a person of color. And I feel like once people are willing to recognize that and then say, how can I change my outlook on things or how can I change that privilege, then they can really start to learn within themselves how to deal with the grief of maybe some things that they've done or seen other people go through and experience. And, that can then start this whole process of working through their grief and being able to be there as well for other people who are grieving, who have experienced some of this racism, and some of this cultural upheaval. And to me, it really does come down to a willingness to do the
Mm.
work.
I'm thinking about people who are willing to do the work and are feeling very paralyzed by all the layers that come along with that kind of work. Even if they're not actively grieving something in their own lives, they are grieving the lack of connection they have with someone they can't talk with this about, right? If whether it's a parent, a sibling, a friend, a boss, there are always thoughts of global states and what's going on in the world at large, even at like city levels, not even globally, where we have this like tongue-tied experience of we don't want to say the wrong thing, but we can't continue to say nothing when we hear dehumanizing language and violence against people, and even just repetitive rhetoric that we know is demonstrably untrue. And yet here we are feeling very trapped. What would you advise someone who is really struggling in that space to say first? Like, if they want to speak up, we know the internet is a great resource and a horrible resource at the same time, right? But I
Yes.
feel like, and maybe you can attest to this, in the last few years, I have seen so many people just screaming into the void online because they need to be heard or speak
Mhm.
what's going on within, and they have no one safe in their world. How can they begin to safely say, this is what I'm thinking, by creating the necessary good kind of conflict that begets more conversation and not just, broken boundaries and vitriolic responses?
Mhm. That's such an important question. There's a few things people can do. One thing I always tell people is that we are not without agency. We have the ability still to do things. We are not as totally helpless as we feel like we are these days, and it's really easy to feel that way these days, especially in the current political climate with everything going
Mhm.
on. But we do still have agency. It's so important to find safe spaces and to find communities of like-minded people. They're out there, whether that's online or in person, but these communities do exist. It's more important than ever now to find your community and to speak out and to be able to find ways to have these safe spaces where you can say what's on your mind and what you need to say and grieve with others, if that's what you're going through. And there is a lot these days. So finding community, finding safe space, if that, it can take a while to build that up for yourself. So in the meantime, I would say journal, get that out for yourself, make a safe space for
Mm.
yourself and journal, take voice notes if you need to, and then play them back, listen for yourself so you know that you have at least created a safe space for you. And then in the meantime, look for those communities and those safe spaces and um, just know that they're out there and that it is important more than ever to support one another right
Yeah.
now.
I really appreciate that reminder for safe spaces simply because we get confused about what that means. I think we take definitions from others or maybe experiences we've had in the past that were safe and then no longer remain safe and get confused about what a safe place might look like for ourselves going forward. How would you help someone identify what safety means to them?
I think, well, going back to your last question first, when it comes to a job space, that can get a little more
Hmm.
complicated where you're surrounded by people who all think one way and then you think another way.
Yeah.
It's creating a paradigm for yourself that you know what's right and to not let yourself, first of all, be pressured by all the talk surrounding you. And it can feel threatening and it can feel violent depending on what that talk is. So I basically tell people to define what that safety is for themselves And keeping in mind that we need to define that both for mentally, spiritually, emotionally, and physically, because we carry a lot of past trauma in our bodies, which is what somatic practice is about talking about or recognizing that so much trauma and fear is still in our muscles, it's in our bodies. And so recognizing what that means to us, and we work through that, identifying when you are stressed or when you are feeling that fear, that trauma, where does it show up for you in your body, where does it show up for you in your head, what do those thoughts look like? So we'll start to really identify that and look into how to change some of that thinking, and I'll bring some cognitive behavioralism into that, because that really does help identify some of the thinking that we have that doesn't work for us,
Mm-hmm.
and how can we change it to be a little bit different, to reframe that thinking for ourselves.
I think that your identification of heart, mind, body, spirit always it totally resonates with me. That's exactly how I approach it with clients as well, making it very clear like you are a whole person, and it is in the divestiture of who you have been in all those parts that make grief so sticky and difficult to navigate, because you have to attend to all of those whole parts. Can you share an example of how you've helped someone understand those four areas of self and really begin to compassionately integrate them back in? Because I know how it works with my clients, but I would love to hear how it works with your clients, especially with the likelihood that you have far higher people of color population in your practice, because the impact of somatic safety on a body of culture is so much more tenuous. There's such violence against bodies of culture that has happened that my body and people with white bodies have not experienced.
Right. It's it's really appreciating and addressing these things.
Mm,
When I work with my clients of color, and most of them are, it is talking openly about these things without judgment and providing that
mhm,
safe space for them that says, let's go over all of it, whatever they're ready for, of course. I try to be responsible in going into the past and talking about trauma. We want to create that space for the grief and the trauma processing without getting stuck there. So we always
yeah.
want to look back with the goal of looking forward. How do we want to change this? So we do that. And
Mhm,
when it comes to the spiritual, the emotional, physical, mental, we I go through and we identify, in all of these areas, and I include like job and socialization and things like that. We'll look at all of that, and I'll have clients actually rate themselves in these areas. How do they feel about how they're doing in all of these areas? And then we'll identify, what do we really want to work on? And spirituality for one client will be very different than with another client. Some people are very religious, some people aren't at all. Some people consider themselves spiritual, some don't at all. But how can we process that grief with whatever spirituality means to that person or doesn't mean?
mhm,
And then we bring in, culture. How in their culture do people grieve? How in their culture do people honor the dead? Or how do in their culture people talk about grief? In some cultures, grief is still a very taboo subject. And so
mhm,
we can take from cultures what we want. There's a lot of beauty in how different cultures honor grief and the dead and things like that. However, in some cultures, because talking about grief can be so taboo, that's the beauty of bringing our Americanism into it, and talking
mhm.
about grief openly, taking that taboo out of it, and just having frank conversations. And a lot of the time, I've found that this is the first time that these clients have been able to talk so openly about their grief, And sometimes the first time they've even recognized that what they've experienced or what they're feeling is grief. And so they finally have that space and that time and somebody to listen without interruption or distraction. And it can be, you can see some really quick changes in people because they're finally getting that time and that space to process all of that.
Finally making space to attune to their own needs and their own crisis
Right.
internally amid all of the other things going on. And that's actually the next thing I wanted to ask you about is given the state of our global experiences right now, our shared chaos and our fears and all of the everything that's happening. I'm thinking a lot about how individuals are creating safe spaces for themselves who are looking for and mobilizing, especially here in the US and in the West, looking for ways to contribute and to push back and to stand up to. I would love to hear your perspective on community building when it comes to the minutia. I'm sure you've experienced it. I certainly have this very black and white approach to how we are looking to create community because it almost feels like any nuance, any acknowledgement of gray space disrespects people who are surviving or who have not survived genocide. I don't think that's where anyone is trying to go. I don't think people are truly not in their heart of hearts being apologists. I think they're scared to understand without making a mistake. So all of that to say
Mhm.
is how would you encourage someone who is entering in a new community and is wanting to protest all these things or create movements but then is faced with, well, you have to believe exactly what I believe in order to remain valid as this a member of this community. Do you get what I'm saying?
I do get what you're saying. Honestly, I see both sides of it in that,
Yeah.
the black and white is because it is a lot more
Yep.
black and white than people think it is.
100%.
There's been a concerted effort for decades now, both governmentally and within society, to shut down conversation about Palestine by saying, oh, it's very complicated or it's very complex, when
Sure.
really it is quite a black and white issue in that sense. Um, but to address what you're saying about people who want to help and they want to learn more, but are afraid of saying the wrong thing, maybe,
Mhm.
or, they're not sure where to start. I would say approach it with an open mind and an open heart and a willingness to listen and learn.
Mhm.
Um, you can speak to someone who is of that cultural community, in this case, a Palestinian American, and say, hey, I don't fully understand what's going on. Can we sit and have a conversation? I'd love to learn more. And it can be
Yeah.
that simple, or go
Mhm.
to a protest and listen to what they're saying. A lot of the time, they're handing out information.
Mhm.
There are certain accounts on social media that people can follow to learn more. But it's really a willingness to learn and to engage. And it's
Mhm.
okay to not always say the right thing. It's that willingness to learn and to grow and to say, hey, I don't know all the right things, but I want to learn.
Yeah.
And so it can be really that simple and just starting a conversation with someone and saying, I want to learn more. Can you guide me in the
Yeah.
right direction?
And I think permission on both ends for the person to say no is really important,
Right.
right? To be able to say, nope, I'm the wrong person to ask, or to decline, nope, you're the wrong person to teach me. That's, I think, what I've been witnessing more of. And
Mhm.
probably because the majority of this um, collective movement is happening in the online arena, right? These local movements are a lot more grassroots and probably have more history with grassroots organizations. And what I'm seeing online has been so difficult to stomach because they're anonymous accounts. They're vitriolic. They're black and white. They're very like, well, you like Garfield, so you can't possibly be a supporter of Odie. Of all the characters to come to mind, Garfield and Odie right now, that's hysterical. But that's what came to mind. Just that you can't possibly be a person in process, I think is what
Mhm.
it comes down to, which we know is very far from the truth. how would you recommend a person, or how do you guide people through the other side of those conversations when they are facing down their need to learn, their need to evolve, their need for transformation, or they've participated in group conversations or protests or marches, and now they're feeling the weight of that collective grief, whether it directly impacts them as they're in their own identity and intersectionality or not? How are you teaching people to steward through that part of it?
I think it's for everybody to be open to a conversation. I think what happens, I know in Palestinian communities and pro-Palestinian communities, um, like I was saying earlier, we're born into this, so we know a lot about the history. And, we've been protesting our whole lives and speaking out our whole lives. For some people, this is
Mhm.
very new, and our American media gives you a very
Mhm.
biased recounting of what's going on. And so people aren't getting the information, they're really not. And so it's a reminder to people in these pro-Palestine communities to be open to giving that information. And I think most of them are, for the most part. And then, for people who are feeling empowered to join the movement and to want to learn more and to speak out about it, it's saying, I want to learn, and maybe if this person is unwilling, maybe they have a good reason for it. Um, because they're so entrenched in it, or they feel like they've been speaking out for so long and nobody has been listening. So they're at the point now of exhaustion with that, and they don't have it anymore. They say the information's out there, find it. And I totally understand that way of thinking. I sometimes find myself feeling that way about it. There's plenty of information out there. It's not nuanced, it's not complex. But you know, if people stick with it, and I think they'll find most people are willing to share that information, or at least point them in the right direction. I think that is the helpful way to go. And to just, Google is out there, so people can Google and try to find, like, where can I start to learn more
Yeah.
about this? I also have a pro-Palestine guidebook that people are welcome to reach out to me for, that's all about grieving while being pro-Palestine. It's 40 pages about all about grief and all about how the culture grieves the people that they've lost. It's about different social media accounts that they can follow. It's about books to read. It's about movies and television shows that they can watch. It's jam-packed. And so people are welcome to reach out to me for that. Right now I have it on my website. So there is information out there for people to want to learn.
I love that generosity. First of all, thank you in what you've created, because that cost you a whole hell of a lot of labor, emotionally, mentally, physically, and spiritually, to put together. So thank you for that.
Yeah.
The importance of your voice and other voices like yours representing different cultures and different expressions of grief, and how it is such a universal and individualized process and experience, are necessary. And I think that that's where, when we are grieving, we become so myopic and miss the point. We miss the expression of grief that is meant to draw us in. And it just makes me think about the way that tears are meant as a social sign for someone to come and offer comfort, right? It's not,
Mhm.
we don't speak out, we don't protest or march or cry in public or express our frustration because we feel better after doing it. That's part of it. But expressing it is to be seen and heard and understood. And I think that to your point, when someone tries to say, well, it's just too complicated to share, it's not, that's just not the right person. That person doesn't have the
Mhm.
somatic presence in their own life to be
Right.
resonant and available to you to go through such an intense and possibly dysregulating conversation over and over.
That's a great point because, like with any grief, some people want to talk about it and are happy to have that opportunity to talk about it. And then some people are more private about it, or it will dysregulate. It will bring up a lot for them if they talk about it. And so they're sort of protecting their peace in a way by doing that. And so that's a great point that you brought up. If someone were to approach someone in the community who isn't as willing to talk, it's probably not something to take
Yeah.
personally. It's probably that they're just not in the place to talk about it and they can move on to someone else. It's definitely not something to take personally. When Black Lives Matter happened, when that movement first took off, I reached out to a lot of my Black friends and said, "Hey, do you want to talk? I'm just putting it out there. You don't have to if you don't want to, but I'm here to listen." And some took me up on it
Yeah.
and some didn't. And that's fine. I don't take it personally because it really does bring up so much for people. So it's just um, giving people some leeway when it comes to that, and not that they're putting you down or they don't feel like you're worthy of the conversation in any way. It's just they're not ready for that conversation.
Well, and it reinforces that they have their own agency and every right to wield it. And I think that that's part of the grief process, at least in my experience, that has been really both rewarding on the coaching side and affirming on the grieving side of being able to, like, oh, this person's not going to force a story out of me. They're not going to make me into a shape that's palatable for them. They're willing to let me be a griever or willing to not let me be a grief professional. Because Olivia, I'll tell you, I have had to stop going to funerals because there's an odd expectation when I show up in the aftermath, right? In the conversations afterwards, where I become a source of advice. And it's not something I'm always willing or even available to offer, but
Right.
that's always on me, right? That's mine. Do I have the energy or the spoons to pour out for this person right now? Or do I need to honor that I'm also here because I'm grieving too? I think that's a really important point you made.
Right. It's important to honor your own grief and say, I do want to help, but it doesn't make me less of a person if I'm not in the place right now because I'm doing my own
Mhm.
grieving.
Yeah.
Um, and that was something during Black Lives Matter. It brought up a lot for a lot of people in that community that
Yeah.
they weren't ready to get into. And I found that as a person of color who has also experienced a lot of racism, but it brought up a lot of my own grief about racism that I didn't even realize I had.
Yeah.
Generally, when you experience racism, it's a thing that happens. It can be traumatic in the moment, but then you move on. So I didn't
Mhm.
even recognize that that's what that was. And that was something that really informed me getting into grief work is that sometimes we don't realize that what we're experiencing is in fact grief. And there can be quite a lot of it when it comes to that.
Well, especially if you've experienced that as such a normal happenstance, as opposed to recognizing that you have every right to walk into any space and not be denigrated for something you have no control over, let alone for things you have control over. Even if you walk into a space yelling and screaming, you should still be honored as a person, maybe just as a person who's having some trouble and needs some extra
Right.
support in that moment. And I think that's what this is really a beautiful conversation for, is that recognition of the individual griefs we are carrying do not excuse us from participation in the collective expression and tending of grief. And that, I think, is where Western grief work has really distanced itself. It is such an individualized culture.
Mhm.
And what I'm witnessing in those safe spaces online, in these different environments, are people who are trying to get to a space of feeling ready enough, safe enough, educated enough to where they want to go toward collective healing. There is no enough. There is
Right.
no moment that you'll finally feel prepared. You just have to start. You have to lean toward, even if you are dysregulated in some way or another, toward a community, toward a cultural group, toward others, to steward this collective grief well, so that when you feel equipped enough, educated enough, You are actually part of the solution and part of the tending that needs to be happening in these communities that are primarily not only historical perpetrators, but who are currently full of people that are trying to divest, who are asking questions of how do I divest from the pain of the past and from the ways that this systemic injustice has actually benefited me. I just, that is where I see little glimmers of hope coming in as people are waking up to their part in all of this.
Right. I am definitely seeing an awakening. It's really twofold because in one sense you're seeing an awakening and you're seeing more people stand up than ever and saying, hey, this isn't right. But then you're seeing the other side of it where there's more hate and racism, at least
Mm-hmm.
openly anyway, that we've
Mm-hmm.
seen in quite some time. It's very polarized right now. And I
Mm-hmm.
know community can be, it's been such a buzzword these days. But there really is something to it, you know, and community can look different to different people, but it is reaching out to like-minded people. And for me, it's been really helpful. Um, you know, a lot of people on social media started out as total strangers to me, but I've built community with them because we have the same thinking and saying that, you know, what's happening in Palestine right now is not okay. Our tax dollars are being used for it. We've got to speak out. And I think it's really easy today to also want to kind of hide and not speak out. And because of the fear of retribution and things like that, we don't know what's going to happen in the future as far as these deportations that are happening. And so it's more important to speak out than ever now and not let yourself be silenced by fear. And that, you know, when it comes to community, that's where we start feeling that, is that even if people don't want to say post things on social media, they can at least connect with their community and find
Mm-hmm.
like-minded people and do other things like boycott or
Mm-hmm.
go to a protest or watch a movie by a Palestinian filmmaker or donate to certain organizations like Heal Palestine that are helping Palestinian children who are victims of this. So we always have agency. There are always things that can be done. There are always things to learn. And so it's just reminding people of that and allowing one another the space to do all of that.
Yeah. Olivia, that is the most beautiful note to end on because our agency and all of those wonderful resources are exactly what people who are listening are going to look for after hearing this conversation and all of your insight. So, thank you so, so much for being here. And I would love to make sure in the show notes we have a link to your website, pact-coaching.com, and that people find you on Instagram and any other social media platform just to gain some wisdom and some insight and some support as they begin to divest and check in with themselves about where they have been complicit and where they can be responsible and gain agency over their own contribution again. Make it something they're excited to share with and support others through. So thank you, Olivia, so much for being
Thank you
here.
so much for having me. I really appreciate the conversation today.
Thank you for listening to episode 189 of Restorative Grief. Olivia's gentle invitations into that reflective state where you can consider your whole self, heart, mind, body, and spirit, are not without the responsibility of remaining present to the grief and the stories and the states of people all around us. I loved her insight about defining what a safe space actually means for you. Does it mean connection in person? Does it mean collective acceptance of anything and everything you're bringing to the table? Does it mean pushing back on things that you know you probably need to divest from? Whatever safety feels like in your body is for you to discover, not for us to tell you. And Olivia's guidance and insight today is a beautiful place to start if you yourself are trying to define that on your own. If you're interested in learning more about restorative grief, both in its online offerings and or one-on-one coaching, please take a look at the show notes and be sure to get the ebook that Olivia so lovingly crafted for you if you are interested in learning more about her work as well. This is an important conversation, and I know a little bit of an uncomfortable one, but what else are we here for if not to adjust how we function in the world and get a little uncomfortable with the status quo? Thank you as always to my patrons and anyone who is responding or reacting to things online. I love sharing these conversations and talking more and more about grief in the public square. So if anything caught your attention or you'd love to chat more, hit me up on DMs or certainly reach out through my website. Again, show notes are here. Follow Olivia and her work online. And as always, before we go, one last thing. Please remember, the only solution for grief is to do the work of grieving. Thank you for listening. I'll see you next week.